If you haven't noticed by now, that song was Yankee Doodle. Now a common kids rhyme, Yankee Doodle actually has some interesting history to it. But before that, I want to welcome you, the listener, to my podcast, and I also want to introduce my guest. Known for his electrifying podcasting, Hollywood standard acting, and phenomenal musical abilities, my very own professor, Professor Allaire. Great to have you, sir.
Thanks, Melissa.
You're funny, man. Thanks for coming on. I really couldn't have done this without you.
I know.
So back to this song. It has a lot of history dating back to the 15th century, but is well known as a patriotic song of the United States. As we know, the term Yankee was used to mock American soldiers of the Continental Army and was sung by British military to mock them. But the Americans took it to the chin. By 1781, Yankee Doodle turned from an insult into a national pride.
You know your music trivia.
Well, thank you, sir. That means a lot coming from you.
A+.
Thanks. So today, I want to talk about the War of 1812, the Second War of Independence.
Not a great name, by the way.
I know. You have a thing with the naming of events and stuff.
You remember.
I do. I remember. So, for this podcast, I want to answer one question. What was the War of 1812?
A great question.
I agree. I know you like to have multiple questions on your podcast, sir, but what we're going to do is we're going to discuss several aspects of this war. I want to talk about the causes of the war, talk some highlights, the end result, and what happened as a result of this war.
The results are pretty powerful, so...
Yeah, I guess. And you, sir, as a historian...
Probably the best in the world.
Right. Maybe you can enlighten us on several topics we are going to discuss. Maybe throw in some fun facts, some context, anything you think is important.
A tough task, no doubt.
Great. So, to be honest with you, I'm going to be using your PowerPoint to go along with this podcast. We're only going to be scratching the surface on the War of 1812 since we got limited time. But I think we can at least leave the listener somewhat satisfied. To begin, since we just talked about him, how about you give us some background on George Washington? I bet you know a lot about him. Maybe a little fun fact?
I like to call him GW.
Yeah. So, enlighten us on the first president of the United States.
So George Washington from Virginia.
Mm?
He was born in 1394.
Wow, didn't know that.
He knew 6 different languages.
Wow, smart guy.
And he focused his whole life on shoes.
Really?
He also wrote a book about the benefits of shoes.
Wow, he really liked shoes, didn't he?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's get started on the War of 1812. What do you say?
Yes.
Great. Let's see. Where can we start?
Well, let's start our journey in the year 1763.
No. I think that's a little far back. How about Okay, so on June 1st, 1812, President
James Madison.
Yes, the 4th president of the United States.
James Madison had a Secretary of State called James Monroe.
Yes, he did.
If you slandered him or said negative things about him, he would often duel with you, which is, you get a shot and he gets a shot at you.
Wow, really? James Monroe? He seemed really...
ill-tempered.
Yep, that's what I was going to say.
A pretty interesting character and a person that you probably wouldn't want to mess with.
Right. So, President James Madison asked for a declaration of war on Britain. He was the first president to declare war on another nation. This war lasted from 1812 to 1814.
Historians consider it to be the first true world war.
I think some might disagree, but okay.
I know I do, so...
I think we could break it down into 4 major causes. One was the imprisonment of American sailors and restrictions on American trade by the British government. The British would literally jump onto American ships and kidnap their sailors.
Attempting to enslave them.
Not exactly. At the time, Britain was at war with France again, and British soldiers would join the American ships as a way to escape the war. To combat this, the British would often stop the American ships and take them back.
This practice was far from acceptable.
Right. The British also enacted restrictions on American trade with European countries, mostly as an effort to stop the Americans from trading with France since they were at war with them.
Unfortunately for the British, this plan failed.
In a sense, yeah, it did enrage the Americans. The second would be that the Americans believed the British were helping the Native Americans,
Indians.
uh, encouraging them to take back their land. Some natives actually adopted the American ways, but not all did. Most notably, Tecumseh and his brother, who
Were mad as heck with it.
agreed. They wanted to unite tribes to stop the Americans from expanding west. A problem for the Americans, and British encouragement wasn't helping.
Stirring things up.
Exactly. Third would be the British saw American expansionism as a problem, believing that the Americans wanted to take over Canada also, as they were taking over the West.
Which is what they really wanted. They wanted more land.
Yes, they did. But for the Americans, this seemed more like a defensive strategy. If they took over Canadian land, they could bargain with Britain over the restrictions and imprisonment. And for the fourth cause of the war, it had a lot to do with politics. The Democrats and the Federalists. The Federalists were more for wanting to have friendly ties with the British, but the Democrats, under James Madison, saw this as a chance to ultimately break away from Great Britain.
This brings up the last point. Disease in general was a problem for these people because the average lifespan was only 32.
Really?
Killing a third to a half of the population.
Again, that's the British perspective.
You know, I thought that was mostly already dealt with at the time.
Well, let me tell you a little bit about it.
No, it's fine. I think we should keep. I think we should move on.
500 horses died.
I said it's fine.
Okay.
One thing worth mentioning, though, is that unknowing to the Americans, before the declaration of war, the restrictions on trade were actually lifted. So the war probably could have been prevented, but due to slow communication, the war was already declared.
Excellent observation.
Thanks. The thing about this war was that both sides weren't really prepared for it. Britain at the time was at war with France, and support for the war on the American side was very low. They also had a real hard time financing
The war effort of 1812.
Yes.
I think a lot of Americans probably felt like they were free falling. So
Right. Most of the war was fought on the Canadian front. The Americans believed Canadians would actually come and support them and help them fight the British, freeing them from their tyranny. Unfortunately for the Americans, though, they were wrong. In 1812, the British, with the Native Americans, seized Detroit and forced General William Hull to surrender. So, feel for the Americans there. It seemed like the British were more successful at times, to be honest.
this is not to say that the British government didn't make some critical mistakes along the way. They did.
Yeah, they did. I'll get that into that. I'll get back into that in a bit. Where was I?
Boy, are you smart.
Haha, yeah, real funny. Oh yeah. The British even managed to take over Washington D.C. and burned the Treasury building in 1814. The interesting thing though is that they only held D.C. for 25 hours. After that, a hurricane actually hit them and it forced them to leave. So, pretty fun fact. They were defeated by a hurricane.
Yeah, pretty cool.
The Americans did have some success though. In 1812, at the Battle of Thames, William Henry Harrison defeated the Native American prophet Tecumseh and his Confederacy.
Yes.
They also managed to prove that the British Navy wasn't invincible. The American ships proved to be superior to that of the British Navy. The USS Constitution was nicknamed Old Ironsides after cannonballs literally bounced off of it. In 1813, at Lake Erie, Officer Oliver Hazard Perry even managed to defeat one of these British fleets.
Great.
In 1814, at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, Andrew Jackson managed to put two Native American groups against each other, and 800 Indians died.
Unacceptable.
Yeah, kind of sucked for the natives.
Yeah, exactly. I agree.
In 1814, the war between France and Britain had ended, and Britain was able to focus more on the Americans now. But attempts to invade the land only failed, and eventually both sides were ready for peace. Because the war with France was already over, the need for imprisonment or the trade restrictions weren't even needed anymore. So the problems that actually began this war were already handled.
Yeah, you're right. Absolutely.
Peace negotiations began in 1814, and the Treaty of Ghent was signed on December 14, 1814. Want to guess who negotiated it?
John Quincy Adams.
Yup, correct.
And he was really the writer of the Monroe Doctrine, which basically told European powers that the Americans were hands off, don't get involved anymore. So he was a great negotiator.
Yeah, he did. Kind of spoiled the ending there, but well, whatever.
He'll play a role with the Spanish later on.
Yeah, sure. Back to the treaty. Again, due to lack of communication, news hadn't reached everyone yet. On January 1815, the British invaded Louisiana, but were defeated in the Battle of New Orleans by Andrew Jackson. This was a huge victory for the Americans, as it was, in a sense, a restoration of national honor. Also, Andrew Jackson was seen as the
Dirtiest in all of American history.
whoa.
He argued that disunion was better.
Without any clothes. So
What?
A conspiracy was brewing to do exactly that.
Well, no, not really. But some viewed Andrew Jackson as a hero, and this view would actually help him later win his presidency. Historians debate as to the outcome of the war.
What was remarkable was that no one won.
Some say it was a British victory, few say it was an American victory, and some say it was a tie.
of course, we'll never know.
Right. No territory borders were changed at all. Basically, everything went back to normal as it was before the war. Really, the only losers here, unfortunately, were the Native Americans, as they lost much more of their land.
Yeah, so this is kind of true and false.
How so?
Population surged. Do you know why?
No. Why?
Shoes.
You mean like on your feet? Like a shoe?
Yeah. People used it as instead as medicine and as a food source.
Wow. I did not even know any of that.
That is exactly what I was hoping you would say.
Yeah. The war also ended the Federalist Party and started the era of good feelings, a time when there was only one party.
Yeah, in a nutshell, the government was fading quickly.
Not really, but okay. For the Americans, the War of 1812 was a win. In a sense, the United States of America was telling Britain, I'm not a baby anymore, okay? I'm a grown-ass adult.
I completely agree with that statement.
Years later, in 1823, John Quincy Adams wrote most of the Monroe Doctrine basically saying this.
Which I already mentioned.
Yeah, you kind of spoiled it earlier.
And John Quincy Adams is the son of John Adams.
Yes, he is. Influence of the doctrine can be said to have started as early as George Washington's presidency, and the War of 1812 basically settled it.
Washington is given credit for many things.
Yes, he is. He did a lot during his time, so he deserves it. Well, that's all I got, sir.
Nice job.
Thanks a lot. It was somewhat fun.
Well, I hope you enjoyed this podcast as much as I did.
Well, yeah, it was my podcast, so I guess, yeah.
Possibly award-winning podcast.
Wow, you think so?
It is what business executives would call a win-win-win situation.
Yeah, exactly. You win, I win, the audience wins. We all learn something.
Let's do a quick review for our listeners since we've gone over a lot of information already. What have you learned so far?
What do you mean? This is my podcast. If anything, I should be asking you that. And if anything, I think most of the things you said weren't even real, so I didn't even really learn anything.
As I like to say, history is complicated.
What does that even mean?
As one historical figure said, some people see things as they are and say why.
Wait, no. This is my podcast. You can't just end it for me. I get to end it. I get the last word. Thanks for
again
listening.
for listening.